Welcome back to the Active Listener, and today we are talking about change, and I'm particularly looking forward to it because we've got three excellent coaches, three people that I know very well and have had the privilege to be coached by at some point. So welcome, ladies. How are you?
Hi, Mark. Oh, great.
Yeah, good. It's glad to be here.
Yeah, pleased to have you here. So there's obviously not going to be any pressure to do today, but you are all experts in regards to change because that's what you do as coaches, help people navigate things in life, wondering where they're going and that sort of stuff. But before we talk about change from a coachee's perspective, I thought it'd be really interesting to hear what your own experiences are with change, whether they're big or small, whatever significant changes that come to mind. So perhaps we can just go around each one of you, starting with you, Lucy.
Okay, yeah. I suppose in terms of big change, there's been a couple of things. I used to teach English overseas, so a big change was going overseas, living in other countries, working in other countries, and then the transition to coming back and working in the UK. And it was almost the transition back to the UK that was the harder one of the two, because going out to another country was exciting. You were learning loads of new stuff, going to new places. And because I was working at a school, you had almost a closed set of people that were instant kind of friends and people to socialise with. And then coming back to the UK, you work, you get a job, and your colleagues don't have that same relationship. They all have their own lives, doing their own thing, and so you're coming back to a country that's very familiar. You know how things work, but you're almost on your own. So that was quite a big change to navigate and to kind of build those connections up again. And if I was to give you an example of a small but significant change, would be one training course I went on to, and I always remember this instance, and she was talking about how you want to present something at a meeting, or you need to create impact and be taken seriously. But if that's your not natural way of being, she kind of gave an example of someone kind of slinking into a meeting, sitting down, looking kind of small and insignificant, and then suddenly having to get up and be this kind of person to be believed and taken seriously, and how that contrast was. And my natural default position is to be kind of under the parapet, not in the limelight, but yet my role requires me to have that presence and present on information. And that was a real pivotal moment for me, realizing I had to address that change of two sides and kind of close that gap and not have that sudden change. And so that was a kind of real learning point for me, and how I conduct myself kind of in various situations to just take that risk and be more open and be more present and challenge myself to do it more often. So for example, if I go to conferences and presenting, I make an effort to do some networking and go and connect with some people that I don't know, just to kind of get into the habit of doing that, which isn't my natural way of being. So that was kind of a small 10-minute bit of a training course, had a huge kind of impact on just my day-to-day life.
For me, I've got two examples. One is the difference between them being one change that I chose and another change that was beyond my control. The first is around choosing, when I started a family, to stay at home with my children, to not work for a period of time. Before that, I'd been a consultant, and so I'd travelled a lot for work, internationally and in this country. And so for me, that was a really big change, because not only was I giving up the job, but the travel and the lifestyle was changing completely. That one actually for me was quite easy to navigate and to manage, because I was very clear why I was doing it. I was in the fortunate position that financially I could afford to. It's something that was discussed with my husband. Not that much, because we were kind of in agreement. There was a brief discussion about whether he should stay at home or me, but I'm not sure it was ever a real discussion. But I was very, very clear on why I was doing it. It aligned with my values. And so what looked like a very big change was actually quite easy. It didn't feel real to begin with, but I think it really wasn't until I'd stopped being on maternity pay and had made the decision formally not to go back to work that actually then it became very real. So I think there was a bit, even though I was clear and I'd chosen it, there was still denial and whatever going on. But actually big change, but relatively easy. One that actually was much trickier. Both, I now have 2 children, two lovely girls, not little at all anymore, and both of them in the last 3 or 4 years, I guess, have been diagnosed with ASD. So they're both on the autistic spectrum. And the change in mindset that was needed to not to accept them, because we absolutely knew that they were before they had their diagnoses, but the changes that it's meant in terms of schooling, in terms of how we have to interact as a family and how I have to interact as a parent with them. That learning curve that I've been on, both before they got their diagnoses and since, and the realization that they're not necessarily on the same path as other people their age, and the time it took me to accept that was actually much more difficult to manage. Partly, I think, because of that lack of control, and the need to try and control bits of it, and the system that you find yourself frankly fighting against is not one that's easy to control. And so yeah, that's taken a lot of reflection. It's taken a lot of some minor changes, some really big changes, to find a new normal.
From Sarah's point around choosing or not choosing, that definitely resonates with me. The significant change I'd like to share is one that I experienced when I was in my mid-20s. So I was on a path with my life in that I was finishing my studies, contemplating finding work after this, and very much it was also in alignment with my romantic life. So I had been on a long relationship, my first love. We'd been years together, had lived together, and then for my final year of studies, in terms of aligning the end of our various degrees and things, I decided to spend a year abroad and then go back to France, where I'm originally from, to join my boyfriend at the time when he would begin his career as well. And so I went abroad, and so this was all chosen and exciting and with a sense of control. And then I had an epiphany at some point that actually the potential life of returning to France, returning to the boyfriend and starting the career was not my life. I just couldn't go down there. And mainly it was the realization that I couldn't continue with the relationship. And at the time, that was a complete shock. It was all within me and sort of my decision, but it came to such a surprise. And I remember the feeling one day I was in such a shock. I felt like somebody had severed one of my limbs away from me, and I was completely lost and confused with this, thinking, what are my experiences? What am I actually feeling here? Really a big surprise. And so it took me a couple of months that were, a lot of introspection and confusion and turmoil, and got a little bit of counseling at the time, and eventually pulled myself back together and went onto a different path, which was to finish my studies, which were in law. I'd done quite a few years of it, but actually not go and become a solicitor, just completely change career and stay in the UK. So I became a tour guide for a year, and then I picked a graduate program in management because I love people. So I thought, great, management. I want something very different from law and paperwork. So I went for logistics, pushing pallets around and talking about big lorries and things like that. And so that felt that I could overcome something that came completely as a surprise, even though it was all within me. And finally, after a bit of introspection, found that actually one of the things that remained true to myself was that I connected well with people. I can find something with management, and then we'll see. So I embraced that as a career. And in a smaller dimension, but also perhaps a story again of maturing. It's probably been essentially becoming a bit more aware of others as I was growing up. So as a teenager, I was sort of very confident about lots of things, and so I was very clever and understood the world, as many teenagers maybe do at times. And so I was still quite sympathetic to a lot of things and curious about other people. But it took me a while and some experiences to move from sympathy to empathy, and sometimes to sort of compassion and feeling really closer to someone and what they're experiencing, especially when it's tough. And it was a very small thing that helped me realize that I was evolving like that. It was after the birth of my firstborn, and giving birth and maybe pregnancy changes your brain in lots of ways. And the hormones are a bit different than your amygdala, so your the part of your brain that responds to stresses and those kind of challenges gets activated in a way so that you just become a lot more sensitive to things. I remember watching something on TV, and there was, I can't quite remember whether there was a little bit of violence or something, and suddenly I was like, oh, I feel really emotional about this, really affected, really sort of triggered. And I was the one who, as a teenager, would watch anything, and violence would not bat an eyelid or anything like that. And suddenly I didn't have a rational reaction to it. I had a very emotional reaction to it. And it immediately brought back to me a memory of my grandmother, and how my grandfather would talk about the films that she would like or not like. And I remember going to the cinema with my grandfather, watching a very, all public, all audiences, happy French movie, where at some point a couple of guys are a little bit drunk and they sort of like throw their fists a bit and they miss each other, but and it's a comedic moment. And the movie was all lovely, and at the end we discussed with my grandfather, oh, it's a shame my grandma couldn't come. And he said, oh, she wouldn't have liked it. And I said, well, that's surprising. She loves love story and comedies and things like that. I said, oh yeah, but there was violence. I was like, what do you mean violence? There was this sort of pseudo fight. And then she said, oh, no, she really doesn't like that. And my grandmother had 7 kids. And suddenly having that realization of me watching a movie years later, several years as well as after the death of my grandmother, I was like, this is what it was. She was a mother, and she was experiencing all these things. And so rather than being a snobbish teenager to say, oh, come on, get over it, then actually it was, no, people resonate with things in very different ways. And especially when it comes to emotional reactions, there's no judgment to put on anything like that. You can relate, and you can just find out a bit more about why it gets triggered. But actually, it's silly to apply a rational judgment and to think, because it's just we feel things, and sometimes it can be triggered by our bodies as well as our histories and memories and so on. So yeah, a tale of maturing and realizing, I've grown a bit more empathetic, and now I can understand my grandmother a bit better through this.
Clearly, all three of you have been through change. I've been through change. It's a constant in life. And indeed, as coaches, you will be listening to people's stories all day and helping them help themselves and navigate the space around change. Now, are there common themes that come up for you?
I think one of the themes that comes up with me for me is the emotions that people experience as a result of change, and quite often they look inwards, and so there are emotions like guilt or blame, where particularly if it's a change over which they didn't have any control, they still try and blame themselves in some way for that, or feel guilt over it, or feel guilt about the way they've reacted to it, how they've dealt with it, and so I think those sorts of things have come up in conversations for me.
So how does that fit into the way our brain works, for example?
Well, I think we all experience different reactions to a feeling of change, maybe because it may trigger a sense of threat to some things that we would rely upon to feel comfortable. So feeling of certainty, of trusting of people around us. There are various elements like that when elements of us are changing, certainly the certainty is shaken by this, and so we will have a reaction that is often similar to a reaction to threat, and so it's a bit the flight, the fight, or the freeze type of reaction. And from an emotional point of view, you get that. So fight is sort of anger or aggression. A freeze could be actually feeling really numb and really passive or really overwhelmed. But I think, or the flight would be the fear, or again those feeling of guilt and trying to avoid what happens and rejecting what happens. So there are all these things happening in our brain as well that are emotions that will take over before we can rationalize them. And even just going through the identification through words of what we experience and the talking through that, which can happen in coaching, can be really helpful, because sometimes the first label of the emotion that comes may not be the most useful. And so through a coaching session, you could work on finding more words and exploring those feelings, so welcoming them into a coaching space, describing them a little bit more in how they feel, what thoughts may be associated with them, and then naming them and pushing those labels to go beyond the basic vocabulary of emotion. And actually, it is quite tricky. It's a vocabulary that's not very common, and maybe in our culture we're quite shy about talking about emotions. So I find that my vocabulary and also with coaches, sometimes we find that it's a little bit poor, and so we can use some tools like the wheels of emotion to try to unpack and look at synonyms, look at opposites as well, or things that are connected, to really go beyond and put some more words through the rationalization of those emotions. Then actually you get a sense of control, actually. And to Sarah's point, you may not have controlled the emotion, it just happened, but you somehow channel it through language, and you put some reins on it, some word reins on it, and it makes it a bit easier then to to grasp it fully and to see how to choose the next reaction.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me is that often people that I talk to about change are coming from an angle of it being a negative thing. Often when there's a sense of being out of control is something that's happening to them, they don't have a choice in that. And so the mindset will be, it's bad. And perhaps there's something about looking at, well, what can we actually control in that circumstance? Change in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. There may be elements that are associated with that, but also understanding where those feelings coming from. Is it that sense of I'm out of control, and is there a deeper root to that that actually goes beyond the initial change that's taking place? Is something a lot deeper that perhaps needs to be explored and looked into?
I think building on from what both of you said about the kind of change happening to people, something I've observed is when they've enacted change and what that's caused. And often the feeling I'm getting from people is relief that they've been able to instigate change that's affected their life and made it better. So there is this whole other side to change. And it can have a sort of physical and emotional response of this, the things that they were feeling stuck or anxious about suddenly go away or change into something else. And again, that's, the new state of affairs could have its own sort of anxiousness about a new path, but there's also that kind of relief that the situation has changed, that they're in a very different place than they were. But it's something I've observed a few times, and it's pretty powerful.
So it's almost that whilst there's an uncertainty, it's because they know at last they're moving on, something is actually happening, that it brings a sense of relief that progress is going to be made.
There's something that comes to me with this example, maybe a slight contrast, but I think the core might be similar. Some of my experience has been where actually when nothing has changed, then it has changed. And so I've had a couple of coaches at different points in time where they came to the coaching space because they wanted to change something, felt a little bit stuck, wanted to change career or a personal situation, and there was an internal struggle and discomfort with their situation at the start. And very often through the dialogue, what now with hindsight I would see is that they were aspiring for an outward change, so change to their circumstances, a change of their roles and so on. And actually talking through this, it seemed that what they were uncomfortable with was something more internal. So in their view of valuing themselves or what they were doing, there was something that they didn't like and they wanted to change that. But in their mind, they hadn't quite realized that it was more perhaps of an inner question than an outer question. And through the coaching conversation and progressing in the understanding of their desire for change, actually both of these coachees came to the realization that it was all fine, and through an acceptance of themselves as they were, so no change, actually everything changed. So they didn't really need to change anything, but their change of mindset or the way they would frame something had shifted to a point that for them it was their objective of doing an outer change had just taken a different form. They had changed inwardly, and it was as powerful as what they thought would come from an external change. And it was really poignant, those moments of insight that I either for one sort of built gradually, and in one of the last sessions, they sort of came with it and said, you know what, I think this is what's happening. And you're sort of like, yes. Or another time was a more of a sudden, mid-flow and sudden revelation. Oh, and quiet, and then they almost shift their whole body and manifest their change of mind. And for both of them, it was like, oh yeah, no, actually, I'm fine. It's all fine. It's all okay. I don't need to change this external thing because now I'm different. I'm transformed in some way, and my outlook on life is different. So I think there is that thing where actually is that attitude to the world as well, that creates the most change when actually the world may not have changed at all, or may not have been changed by the person.
I can really relate to that, Agnes. I think that the coaching conversation and the reflection that the coachee undertakes as part of that, can just lead to more self-awareness and understanding that can just, as you say, give that transformational change in how they think and feel when the things around them haven't changed. It's them choosing to change the way that they react or the way that they think about something.
So it's very much about your mindset and your response rather than what's changing or not changing outside. So it seems to me as well, there's something there about resilience and how we cope with change, whether it's where we can actually deal with what's happening from the outside, or whether we're dealing with our own mindset and the way we view the world, the way we process things. Change is constant. We're always seeing that happen. Can you suggest ways that people could perhaps build that resilience, become used to change, how they go about dealing with it?
I think there might be something around acknowledging and celebrating when little or big changes have happened to oneself, and so making a note of it. I certainly find that I've built my resilience to big changes, and so I've become much more open to change, because now there's always a part of me that think, oh yeah, I've done something like that before, and it's never the same. You never cross the same river twice. It always changes, but because I take a little bit of time to acknowledge when I've well either there's been change around me or when I've changed, I always find a common thread that helps me whenever there's a new challenge to say, well, I've done something similar, and if it's not within me, then I'll take a leaf of the NLP book, and then if somebody has done it, then it's possible that I might be able to do it, and I'll just work and build towards that. But for my personal experience, just finding the moments looking back where I've done something similar, even if it's just by a thread of similarity, that's really been helpful for me.
Yeah, I think building on what Agnes says, it's about reflecting on those things that you have done before and the connections that you can make. So what is it that you already know that can help you with this change? Who or what can help you with the new mindset or the whatever it is, and recognizing those skills that you already have, and adapting and building on those.
And I think to add to that, I would say talking to other people, because change often happens collectively. We experience it differently, but that change is happening to other people. And talking to, a colleague, a friend about what you're experiencing, and just that act of talking about it can help clarify your own thinking and the way you react to it. So I think always never underestimate the power of a good chat to someone.
I totally agree with that. I think it's the connection, and it's the feeling that someone else can identify with what you're feeling, and it reduces that sense of isolation, and that it's your problem. If it becomes a joint problem, then that's a nicer place to be.
another thing that I found helpful, and again, to bring back an element of certainty when things may feel really out of control, is to go back to my personal values, and that's something that I found in common with some of my coaches as well, to kind of get back onto what matters for that person, or what brings them moments of joy or moments of flow, and in small measures as well as bigger measures. And by becoming a bit more aware of these things, you know that you will carry them with you through the change, that this is almost what makes you you, and that's a relative constant in your life. So whatever happens around you, whatever challenges, then you can still rely on that strength or that excitement about something, a particular passion, a value. And so so in my example at the start of the podcast, it was actually what will I do with my career now? I'm not going to be a solicitor. I'm not going back to France. Where do I start? And it was like, well, actually, when were the times where I've really had a sense of enjoyment, or I felt that that I had a purpose. And it was thinking, oh, actually, I really like working with people. I like problem solving when when you know something happens that wasn't planned, and teamwork. And I thought, oh well, and maybe where can I find that in a job? And that suddenly a career path appeared, and you know, that's still true today, although I've changed my jobs many times, and it's taken me in lots of different places. So from an external point of view, people say, well, you've gone through a lot of change, and for me, I'll be like, that's still me. I'm still doing the same thing. So it manifests quite differently. So going back to what's a key value for you, that will be one of the constant that may bring a little bit of peace in a chaotic world.
I think the other thing that's very important for me is understanding what you can control in a situation and what is out of your control. One of the shapes that we use in our shapes toolkit when coaching is the circle of control, and understanding that you can't control the change, but you can control how you react to it, for example, or understanding that you can control how much effort you put into doing a job, but you can't necessarily control how other people view that. And there are many other examples, but then you focus your energy on the pieces that you can control, and you try and learn to not focus so much on those that you can't control, and that helps you build that resilience and those boundaries that will be much healthier.
So there seems definitely something there about being empowered, being proactive, recognizing what you can and can't do, not being alone, acknowledging that other people will be going through change and we all deal with that in different ways. But there usually is something that we can actually do rather than it just all being done to us. So having listened to one another and discuss what we have, are there any real sort of take-home points that you would take or would say, and are there any other things you'd like to add?
Yeah, there's one more thing that I think is really important when dealing with change and thinking particularly around the resilience to deal with it, which is to be kind to yourself. And quite often that's the hardest piece.
I've really enjoyed sharing the stories as well, and learning about everyone on the podcast. And so to Lucy's point and Sarah's point, you know, creating a connection and sharing the stories, I think that really helps put things in perspective and feel that we're not on our own. We're in this together.
Brilliant, thank you. And as always, it's a pleasure to have a conversation and to listen to the insight that you have. And I look forward to having the three of you back on at some point. I know I think all of you at some point will be a guest host on the Active Listener, so I look forward to that and learning what you're going to talk about. But for the meantime, thank you very much and for coming on.
Thanks,
Thank you, Mark.